Thank you for tuning back into Acid Horizon. This is Craig, the host of the podcast, and we are winding down 2024, and one of the ways that we're going to do that is I am going to represent a lecture that was given by Claire Colebrook at the Time Waste Extinction Workshop at Penn State University in September earlier this year. Earlier in the fall, I put this lecture on our YouTube channel, but I am presenting it here now on all of our podcast feeds in case you missed it. If you have already heard Claire's paper, then I suggest you navigate to Left Hand. That's my personal solo podcast where I conduct inquiries into the intersection between philosophy, politics, and particularly psyche or psychology. I recently conducted a fascinating interview with Dr. Robert Langen on the intersections of Jung and Spinoza's work, and also how Hegel's criticism of Spinoza brings to bear on the history of psychoanalysis. Folks who subscribe get to listen to episodes early, but there's plenty to listen there already if you haven't checked it out yet. And just one more brief note before we get to Claire's paper, which is the Anti-Oedipus files are starting very soon in conjunction with the Schizoanalysis Project. Hop into the links, find the Schizoanalysis Project Discord server, get in there. If you're subscribed to Patreon already, then you're probably up to date with the Anti-Oedipus files and the proposed syllabus. Everything is starting very soon. Just subscribe at the $5 level so you can ensure that you'll be along for the ride with us in 2025. And one last thing, since we are at the end of the year, many people are carousing, visiting families, some people are stuck working. Whatever it is that you're doing, we just wanted to say thank you for your support over the year, and please take care of yourself. And please make sure you stay connected to support networks if this is a challenging time of year for you. Okay, let's hop right into Claire Colebrook's lecture, What's Wrong with Extinction, if anything?
So what's wrong with extinction? I think the clearest answer is obviously nothing, right? It just happens. But then the second answer to that is when you say that, what is wrong with you? Of course there's something wrong with extinction. Like, we're all going to die. And then the answer to the question, just if you want to fast forward to the end of the paper, is it depends. What's wrong with this? It depends. So I want to look at three words: end, death, extinction. And even though I'm going to be using a primarily literary history focus or methodology at the background. So if I were to have a PowerPoint, it would have one phrase from Derrida, end of the book and the beginning of writing. What does that have to do with extinction? Within the broad project of which this is a fragment, I argue that there's two senses of the end of the book and the beginning of writing. The obvious sense, the very French 1960s sense, is if we stop reading bounded books, Hegel's Phenomenology, Henry Fielding's Tom Jones. You can see I'm really on fire today. If we stop reading the bounded book and allow writing to emerge, we'll end up with Mallarmé, James Joyce, Artaud. So it's an aesthetic sense, the end of the book and the beginning of writing. And that would be a good reading if we were focused on the 20th century, late 20th century reading of Derrida, that it was primarily to do with the history of philosophy and the technologies of producing philosophy. Since then, of course, there have been other readings of Derrida that when he talks about writing, he doesn't mean pen and ink in any narrow sense or literal sense, but tracing relationality, marking out so that one might refer to evolutionary processes as a form of writing. And there's many instances of this reading of Derrida that what I do when I'm writing is a smaller version of processes of life in which relations precede, exceed, and disrupt the terms that they produce. If it's that reading of writing, then the end of the book would mean the end of closed, relatively stable forms and the beginning of processes that exceed, disrupt, and extinguish those forms. So there's two readings of Derrida. One would be a shift from proper names, privatised, held in the handwriting, towards something like high modernism and the avant-garde. Another reading of Derrida, I think the latest book I read that would be compatible with this is Deborah Goldgarber's Speculative Grammatology, so that writing would refer to things like evolutionary processes of which we are fleeting events. Two very different possibilities and undecidable which one is right. Okay, so within that, end, death, extinction. If we were to take that first reading of Derrida, end of the book and the beginning of writing, there would be something like an affirmation of extinction. Like we're just the fleeting moments of stability that appear in a general process of tracing, marking, and radical futurity. We don't own the processes that bring us into being, nor can we master or command them. Affirmation of extinction. That other reading, the, let's say, literary high modernist reading, that the end of the book would be the end of the bounded form, the book, the beginning of writing, modernism, avant-garde, aesthetics, might seem to be a very dated and misguided philosophy in the wake of climate change and the sixth mass extinction. So you could get that very frequent response to Derrida and post-humanism, as in they were all talking about post-humanism and the end of man in the 20th century, and now that we're really going to die, how's that working out for you? So that those two tensions between end of the book. Are we talking about the end of a particular moment within history or something more radical? Okay. Humans are events of extinction. And here I take this in two senses. Literally, as in we emerge after a whole series of mass extinctions, right? Without prior mass extinctions, we don't exist. One could go into the science of that, but I assume that everyone in the room agrees with that, right? Like if there hadn't been prior extinctions, we would not come into being. There's one way of reading that. One would be in a temporality of emergence, that it's through the decline and extinction of less complex forms that one moves towards greater complexity. And in some ways, that's the image of extinction that ends Darwin's Origin of Species, that there's a flourishing life that ebbs and flows. And he talks about the destruction of forms. So different forms coming into being, and it would be a sort of forward movement. But at any rate, humans are already the effects of extinction and climate change, literally. But the other sense is the sense of the human as a species. So if there had not been theories of extinction, Cuvier in 1796, the discovery of extinction, Darwin would not later have been able to theorise humans as a species that is a form of life that comes into being and passes away within a temporality that exceeds human life. So I take this to be my favourite moment in Foucault's order of things. Prior to the 18th century, the concept of life did not exist. Just love that, and make sure I put it into every publication or talk I give, even if it, let's just pause on that. So that prior to the 18th century, the concept of life did not exist, and that is crucial to the formation, oddly, of the human, not as a form. The human is no longer a form, but a process. So what do I mean by that? And here is where I will turn to literary history. Prior to the theorization of humans as a species, so I'm with you, with Ted, I I find the concept of the species problematic, right? And it goes back to days in phenomenology where you think, okay, transcendental subjectivity is not humans as a species, right? It's a form. However, if you took all the transcendental subjectivities and the humans as a species and had a Venn diagram, do they fully overlap? And then it's humans, humanity, the human is not the same as the species, but it's undecidable at what point those two are different. Hope that makes sense. Okay, so historically, prior to extinction and species, the human is a form that is defined essentially through death. So death is intrinsic to the human. And from this we can, what do I mean by that? Aristotle, call no man happy until he is dead. Aristotle is already taking that, right? It's a received wisdom, meaning that my biological life, my material life, is insignificant compared to what one makes of one's life. And what one makes of one's life is not simply not reducible to biological existence, but appeals to something that exceeds the time of biology and life. So being a good human is not merely staying alive, eating, looking after one's health. It's not what Foucault referred to as biopolitics, managing one's existence, maximising one's bodily life, but orienting or attending to or desiring something that is other than mere life. So maybe I think we can see that clearly in Aristotle. To live is to be oriented towards a form of life. But, and here I'm going fast forward, I think that's also true for Deleuze, right? I think that was implied in the much more complex version of your talk, but to live up to something that is beyond one's time or out of one's time. So it doesn't just mean the life of one's present, but imagining what one might be from a point of view outside of one's own time. Think of oneself as a counter-effectuation in that event. So in that sense, the human as form is tied to death and ends, and I think this was also coming out in discussions of mourning, to lose that person, to lose this being. I'm not concerned with the biological existence, but the sense of that existence, versus worrying about one's species being. So humans as a species are tied up with a sense of extinction, but humans as a form are tied up with death, ends, something that is not life. And so one might even imagine that trying to save the species, let's imagine here and now. Let's just institute a state of emergency, because it's possible, right? That we're like, okay, we definitely got to save the species. We should probably turn off all the lights, pull down the library. I'm just suggesting, right? If we were really concerned with the species, obviously we're going to go someday, right? So we can't go on. But if we're Bertrand Russell and we're getting a little uptight about 99 million years?
1 billion longer for the Earth, they say now.
Oh, okay.
In the time, it was thought we'd have.
But we could probably we'd definitely live longer if we stopped driving, got rid of the library, got rid of the lights, got rid of the PowerPoint, the podcast world, right? So saving the species would mean getting rid of the human as a form. I'm prepared to take objections now if you've got I have this terrible habit when I'm teaching. I'm like, correct me if I'm wrong. And of course, no student is going to correct you if you're wrong, but you guys definitely would, right? So I think it's clear that there's a differences of degree that end up in, like if we want to save the species, if we're really concerned about saving the species, probably what we're doing right now is not helping. However, if we're concerned in saving something other than mere species life, then maybe what we're doing is helping. But that's a question. Okay, so here's where I want to shift this towards literary history, maybe to make it a little more clear and maybe to arrive at a sort of so where does this leave us moment. And I've already mentioned, so I have like my dates, the moment of extinction, let's say late 18th century, right, where we start to think about humans as a species. So you can think of death of civilizations, the annihilation of states, the annihilation of archives, lost libraries, lost cultures, lost languages. But it's only once one can think of loss of species, right, that you get a completely different sense of the human. And I think that's the one we're confronting. And I think that's the one Bertrand Russell was confronting. I also want to say it's one that was being worked through in literary history. So here's where I go through to literary history. But I want to do this not just because I'm from the English department and I feel that that's my job, but because I think it's an essentially literary problem. And by that, I mean that the sense of humans as a species is obviously a literary event, right? Someone has to read the fossils, write about what they mean, disseminate that sense, say, this is us, right? It's an inscriptive, it's a textual, it's a literary event. It transforms our being. It changes our affective comportment towards the world. But there's a deeper sense in which humans are a literary event. And one of the ways to think about this is through Bernard Stiegler's concept of the archive, which is to see the human as an effect of stored time. That is, we are the effects of the objects that we create, everything from an iPhone. Let's just start with a pen, right? When I pick this up, this stores a history of the hand that can write, paper, the capacity for language, script, and so on. This is the way we store memories. When I pick up a bottle of water, right, yes, there's a biological event, but I'm also storing memory. Bottled water is something that it's an invention occurred, I think, within my lifetime, bottles of water. And it's tied to practices. So I take this to be an archival object in Stiegler's sense. A teacup is an archival object. It's the way we retain the form of the human across time. So an archive is this, but it is also this. Non-humans have archives. Bees, ants, migration patterns, these things. And maybe this is contentious, it probably is. Stiegler refers to what distinguishes the human from the animal is the temporality of its stored archive. That is, that it can exist beyond one's own time. Maybe I'll get into that a little more later. Okay, so here's the literary history moment, and I'm choosing two texts, partly because I like them, but more, I think, because they mark this shift between human as form, human as species, what it means to think the end or death or extinction of those. And so in the first moment, human as form, one can think about death and ends, but humans as species, one can think about extinction. So how we think about the human is intertwined with how we think about ends, death, extinction, archives. My first text, Milton's Paradise Lost, my first quotation. So even though I did lose my paper in both its digital and hard copy, no need, because I can pretty much recite Paradise Lost from memory, except for the boring bits. So this is a line, famous line from Book 4, where we're talking about Adam and Eve, and one of the feminists' favourite lines, he for God only, she for God in him. Why do I think this is important? Because yes, it's a theory of male-female, right? It's a theory of sexual difference. It's got nothing to do with biology, though. It's got to do with recognising, right, in someone who is different, what they embody. So the human as form is the form life takes in order for reason to exist. And that's an idea that is not only Milton's, it's Hegel's. I would say it's Deleuze's as well. Yeah, it's Deleuze's as well, right? So that we exist in order to think. It's not that I exist and then I think, right? It's like being worthy of thinking. So straight line from Milton through Hegel to Deleuze, and there you have it. So that the difference between, for Milton, he for God only, she for God in him, is it's not a biological theory of sexual difference. It's a formal theory of sexual difference tied up with a formal theory of the human, that what it is to exist well and to exist properly is to embody a form of life, and that when one dies, that form gets taken up again by someone else, right? And I'll just leave that. There were other things I could say about that. Milton's obviously not the only instance of that. The reason why I chose him is because he gets rewritten later by Mary Shelley through a different conception of life by way of extinction. Not only does Milton in Paradise Lost have this sense of we exist in order to think, and in order to think the universe, like without humans, you've just got life, but life doesn't know it's life. You've just got birdsong, but birdsong isn't given the form of poetry. Again, I think this is Deleuze as well, right? Like we've got art, but art is the means through which the cosmos comes to hear itself. I think Deleuze is, again, very Hegelian in that. Milton also has a theory about the end of the book. And it is close to books exist to capture thinking, and that thinking is in excess of our biological, material, or temporal existence. So in Areopagitica, which is, I think, often taught to undergraduates as like the first text about free speech, and that's just not what the book, what it's about. But he does say it's better to kill a human being than to burn a book. Because if you kill a human being, you just kill a human being. You kill a book, you kill something eternal. Now, I know books aren't eternal, but they exceed our existence. They capture something. And Milton is writing this at a time when the book is coming into being, as in stored memory, right? So he's writing about Shakespeare and Shakespeare becoming something so monumental that you could burn every physical copy and it would still exist. Right, so I suspect that the people in this room haven't read the entire corpus of Shakespeare. Like, maybe? Like all of them, right? But we know it enough, right, that if it were all annihilated, like suddenly Shakespeare gets annihilated tomorrow, I'm like, okay, we'd better write, like, what can we remember? The greatest hits. So there's this sense emerging that, so Milton is writing in the 1660s, 1650s. It's also the time of the Little Ice Age, where you're getting a sense of possible global catastrophe. It's also written at a time of political revolution, such that what dies and what gets saved becomes a political decision about what it means to be human. And up for grabs at the time he's writing is also the very concept of property as well. So it's a time of apocalypse, it's a time of political apocalypse, it's a time of the hint of climate change, the little ice age, and it's a time of storing the archive in a manner in which it can also be destroyed. The end of the book for Milton would be the end of reason and the end of life. Better to kill a human being than to burn a book. These are not my thoughts, these are Milton's. So that sense of the end of the book would be one in which the human would be something eternal and formal, and the proliferation of life would be something that threatens the human. If all one is concerned with is the replication and intensification of existence. So Milton's also an early anti-capitalist theorist. Okay. Second text I want to look at is Mary Shelley's, two texts by Mary Shelley, concerned with extinction, concerned with life, concerned with the archive, and concerned with the end of the book. The first is Frankenstein, which I keep promising myself never to mention again, and here it is. It's just the return of the monstrous. So, Mary Shelley is writing Frankenstein in the early 19th century. If Milton was writing Paradise Lost in the era of the Little Ice Age, Mary Shelley is writing in both The Year Without a Summer. So there's again a sense of possible death of the sun, the Bologna prophecy, which does predict the death of the sun and then the death of all life. So that's the milieu in which she's writing. So instead of human beings, as they are for Milton, being a form where death, birth, just ebbs and flows, humans come into being, they pass away, but the human remains the same, Mary Shelley quite clearly has a sense of humans as a moment in life where life can take on a life of its own. Life can take on a life of its own. So Victor Frankenstein, for those of you who haven't read the novel, Victor Frankenstein creates what he hopes to be a replication of himself. And he does it because he goes to university and he reads the wrong books. So he's being lectured on the life sciences and he's getting legit science and he's like, no, there's got to be something more to it than this. Goes into sort of like a rogue independent study with himself and decides he's going to replicate himself and imagines himself as like the master of the universe. He's trying to replicate himself. So he's obsessed with the human as form. And when he creates this human, what happens is it has a life of its own. He doesn't recognize it as human. It's monstrous. So he refers to it as the creature. It's beyond one's own form and it's beyond one's own reason. Shelley starts to explore what happens when life proliferates beyond our recognition of the human. Victor, decides that he has to annihilate this being that is not him, that he can't recognize as human. The creature, how does the creature become human? He overhears a family reading Paradise Lost, right? So he learns, and it's a he. So in Mary Shelley's novel, the creature wakes up and sees light, dark, cold, birdsong. Right? It's like completely orphaned, blank space. Not tabula rasa. It's not a blank slate. It's sensations. Right? It's not. It's a being without form. It's pure receptivity. This creature overhears a family reading Paradise Lost, Also, the texts the creature absorbs include Volney's Ruins of Empire and other texts about the history of empire, the lives of the great imperialists. So, what we have in Shelley, her first text, after the thought of extinction, she's writing in the early 19th century, the beginning of a sense that the world might be annihilated, that extinction might happen. It's not fully thought through or fully theorized scientifically, but there's a conception that, going back to, if we really want to save the human as a species, this is, I think, Mary Shelley's question in Frankenstein and her later The Last Man, if we really want to save humans as a species, what do we need to destroy? And in her exploration of this question, the human archive is a really ambivalent object. So the monster creature, let's not misname, the creature becomes human by listening to the archive, but in doing so starts to speak a language of lord and bondsman. Says to Victor, "You're my master, you're my father, you owe me," right? And so partly the sense is becoming human is also becoming something at odds with life, and that Victor is, if you like, too attached to the human as form that all he wants to do is annihilate this proliferating life, because the creature says to Victor, "Okay, you don't want me in your family, nobody wants me," right? "Just give me someone I can, give me someone I can hang out with." And then Victor just, oh my God, they're going to breed, right? And then they're going to take over. And then they'll no longer be me. So Frankenstein starts to confront the curious relationship between humans as form, those things we recognize that are not merely life, humans who read, humans who know Milton's Paradise Lost, humans who are attached to the histories of Europe, versus a human that comes into the world that is life, but that we can't recognize as human. And the fact that the history of reading Frankenstein is split sort of not as far down the middle as it should, right? So if you look into the literature, there's a lot of essays about Frankenstein in bioethics literature, because it's deemed to be Victor played God and now his chickens have come home to roost. That's a very poor reading of the novel. In my opinion, the correct reading of the novel is one that can't really be correct. It's the archive that the creature listens to that forms him as human, that forms his desire to be human. I want to be part of this world. I want a Mrs. Monster. I want a home. I want recognition. I want a master. I want a lord. I want a father. He hears all these things and wants them, but the things he wants to be human can't recognize him. Everyone that is human wants to annihilate him the minute they see him. That's Mary Shelley's first text. It's poised at this undecidable moment of recognizing that we come into being through inheriting an archive that produces us as who we are, even if that archive is also going to mean our own destruction. So that we might think of the creature listening to Paradise Lost listening to the story of a family, learning to become, this is for the Deleuzians, learning to become an Oedipalized being. I want a father. I want a nuclear family. I want that. That moment of coming into being a human might be at odds with a life that is more intense, but we don't quite know. Okay, so that's Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. More importantly is Mary Shelley's Last Man, written a couple of decades later. Not as many movie versions of this one, not as widely read. 1826, so there'll be maybe some events coming up celebrating if we exist then. So it's about a global pandemic, or we think it's global. We only hear about it from the Northern Hemisphere, that wipes out humans and only humans and leaves one person and one dog in Rome. Okay. So in The Last Man, I'll give a little précis of the plot. It's two travellers going on a tourist trip, stumble into a cave in the early 19th century, and there's just how many of you here have read it? Okay, yeah. Or as we say it in Melbourne, I read it once, but it's been a while, right? Which means... So stumble into a cave and there's all these leaves and you pick one and it's written in Urdu and this one's German and this one's French. Oh, I don't even know what that language is. Oh, but look, this one narrates, there's one, this is the French Revolution. Fancy that. Oh, this is the English Civil War. Fancy that. Oh, look, this is one that's about the end of humanity in the 20th century. And that's the novel. So someone picks it up and reads it. It's already happened. And then the end of humanity occurs, it starts to be narrated in a post-monarchy Britain, which of course we still haven't got to yet, in which it's now a republic, there's the threat of a returning monarchy, and a global pandemic starts to wipe everyone out. The central character is just sort of a witness to watching all his friends die, watching his children die, watching all of Europe die. And to cut a long story short, and it really is a long story, to cut a long story short, ends up as the last man with his dog and decides the end of the book begins with him going forth to find the libraries of the world, which will include Homer and Shakespeare. I mean, when you say, oh, it'll include Homer and Shakespeare, you don't mean, and the other stuff, but I do think it's interesting that she mentions Homer, Shakespeare, and not anything that comes later. Okay. Why is this interesting for us? Because written at a moment of revolution, written at a moment of abolitionist politics, written at a moment of sexual politics, rights, written at a moment that starts to question the state form, written after Shelley has already posed the question of we are creatures produced through an archive, even if that archive and our attachment to the archive is what might annihilate us or refuse us or not allow us to live on. Shelley writes a later novel in which there are very few books until the end, in which humans are wiped out by a virus. So I think, Ted, did you say it's the first of, what genre did you call it?
Dying Earth.
Dying Earth, right? So it's not really a dying Earth, but it's a dying species, right? So yeah, because the Earth's doing just great. Although she doesn't have that sense, that the COVID sense of like, oh, geez, look, there's less planetary damage when we all stop doing what we're doing, but it's a dying species, right? So it's the beginning of that. It's not quite extinction, is it, if it's a viral pandemic and it's the annihilation of humans. She writes this in response to imagining what it might be to confront the question of life, proliferating life, versus the human form, the archive that makes us want to be who we are. And maybe, I think Frankenstein ends on this really ambivalent note, maybe the archive and the humanity to which we are attached, including the familial form and including the state form, including empire, maybe the archive to which we are attached is going to destroy us as a species, but maybe the species will survive in the absence of only if we destroy the archive, and I think she takes a bet both ways. Then in The Last Man, she annihilates the human species and we're left with one person, and it's one male person, right? So we can't have that. If you've read books about the end of the human species, Marlene's Severance, the character turns out to be pregnant at the end. So we have this maybe hope, who knows. This is one man left with his dog and the books of the world. Just to use this as a thought experiment, or to think about maybe going back to that Venn diagram of humans as a species, humans as a form, right? At what point is there any non-overlap? Are they fully overlapped? Are they different? Okay, so the conclusion. On the one hand, this moment we are living in, we are all Victor Frankenstein, right? We are all trying to kick ourselves loose of the archive we inherited, trying to find a counter archive that will help us live on. I think that's the condition of the humanities right now, isn't it? That we're trying to reinvent the canon, reinvent the archive, knowing that the very form that brought us into being might also be toxic, autoimmune, but also knowing that desire to live on through an archive might be at odds with life. No, it is at odds with life. Correct me if I'm wrong. It is at odds with life. If all we were interested in were life, mere biological being, there might be the desire to erase any archive whatsoever. So we are Victor Frankenstein trying to hold on to a form of life in the face of a proliferating existence that we've also brought into being. We're also the creature that's been brought into being. We've inherited an archive we didn't write. We overhear it. It's handed to us. We don't choose the books we read. I mean, we do, but we don't. And we might want to refuse that archive. We won't want to say, I am not this form of the human. But there is no archive-free zone in which we can live. So we're Victor Frankenstein attached to a form that's being disrupted, threatened with annihilation by life, but we are also a life at odds with that form. So we're Victor Frankenstein, and we're also Frankenstein's creature, at war with the archive, trying to be excluded by the archive, effects of the archive, attached to the archive. But I think The Last Man makes this more complicated again because it has a more futural component. It's written not what would we do if there were a life proliferating beyond the forms we recognise. It would be, what would it mean to read our own existence, like to pick up, oh my goodness, here's someone who's telling us about our imminent end, when all that's left will be the books that we didn't write that were before us. So this is my concluding point. We are at once, right, at this moment, where Lionel, the central character of The Last Man, we're left in the final stages of the world with books, right, that we now might hope to save, where the character prior to the narrative arc of The Last Man. We're beings who finally picked up that sheet of paper that says, by the way, you're going to die. So I think this is where we are. Like, we all know, like humans all know we're going to die someday, but suddenly there's an impending death sentence, and that all will be left is an archive that no one can read anymore. So we're Lionel, we're someone who's telling the story or reading the story of The Last Man. And finally, so we're not just this or that, we are also all the characters of every novel that dies away in order for the novel to reach its end. So we all know when we read a story, usually the central character or the narrative arc has to, this changes, but has to remain alive in order for the story to finish. But there will one day be a story in which we are the characters whose existence didn't matter for the end. So we're just moments in a narrative arc. So what does this mean going back to end of the book and the beginning of writing? So I began with 2 senses of that, and I want to conclude by reiterating those two senses of the end of the book and the beginning of writing. So to return to that first, let's call it the French post-60s literary sense of the end of the book and the beginning of writing, that begins with a aesthetic, or it is an aesthetic and moral imperative that is only if we can liberate ourselves from proper names, closed books, privatized literary objects, might we be able to think a form of writing that exceeds the forms of the human that we currently recognize. So maybe there are forms of archive and writing that will live on that aren't the ones to which we're attached now, and maybe those might generate more life. That's the sort of literary sense. But then there's the more existential sense, in which the end of the book might mean the end of what's readable and recognizable, and the beginning of writing as a form of life or process that could no longer be recognized as human. And between those two, it depends. It's undecidable. Thank you.